16 April 1963. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms.
April 1963, 62 years ago this spring, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed for the first time in his life. I'd like to start by looking at his name. It's a long one. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. All of that is important. Reverend, he was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of pastors. What he did in civil rights was very much through the Judeo-Christian tradition and spirit. Doctor, he had a PhD in theology. Martin Luther was a great reformer within Christendom. King, he did lead a movement, and Jr., a nice nod to his beloved father. Sometimes I think that another name or two could easily be slipped in with all those others. Perhaps Shakespeare, because he was a great writer. Perhaps Lincoln, because he was a great speaker and liberator. When arrested in Birmingham, he was not permitted a phone call. The mattress was removed from the bed in his cell, leaving a metal wire frame for sleeping. He had been arrested in the first place only because the city fathers had gathered together and outlawed public protest. The outlawing of public protest rings a little familiar right now and is something of which to be wary, because without nonviolent public protest and direct action, the alternatives become rather dire. So there he was in this cell without a mattress or a phone call, but what he had was a pencil. He had a pencil and he had some scraps of paper in which his sandwiches delivered to him as meals had been wrapped, and some margins of old newspapers. And on these scraps, Dr. King composed the following letter, which we'll look at both in terms of civil rights, social justice, and in terms of literature. I would maintain that Dr. King is one of the great American writers on top of everything else. It started, like you heard, my dear fellow clergymen. He set a positive and inclusive tone from the start. It's not confrontational. What he's hoping to establish is common ground. And he does that in a number of ways throughout the speech. I made a list of all the different rhetorical strategies that King uses. Not rhetorical tricks, that's the word you usually hear with rhetorical, but these aren't tricks. Because when it's geared toward truth, that's not a trick, it's a strategy. He uses a combination of all of these, and you'll hear some of them. Flattery, justification, redefinition of a word we think we know the meaning of, asking a rhetorical question because he'd like to supply the answer to it, establishing a premise with 4 points in this case, each of which he then goes on to prove. Illustration, which in this case gets fairly emotional, particularly compared to the more intellectual and rationalistic arguments that he's making. a cataloging of efforts to date and of suffering over the centuries. The claiming of moral high ground, expressing disappointment and proposing a solution to that. Concurrence, in other words, I know that we all believe X, so can we get to Y? And repetition for effect, not exaggeration for effect. There's no hyperbole in this letter, or any of Dr. King's writings, or speeches that I've read or heard. Repetition for effect to create a kind of a chorus, a refrain, coming back to the same word or clause or phrase again and again. And the final rhetorical strategy I'll mention is poetry. There is poetry to this man's writing, just as there was a performance quality to his delivery of speeches. He never delivered this. It wasn't a speech. And it's somewhat static on the page. But if you bring in a good actor, the letter comes to life.
I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I am here because I have organizational ties here, but more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative.
I'd like to point out a few things here as Dr. King pauses to compose more of the letter. I heard some reactions out there, and I had the same reaction myself when I hear Dr. King write, anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. He does not distinguish between documented and undocumented, because family separations are about the last thing that this man would ever support. He's looking at members of the human family, wherever they come from, in America, defining them as Americans. And he would only use the word alien if he were referring to people from outer space. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. One of the famous lines from Dr. King. And it reminds me of another line written and spoken decades later by Nelson Mandela, who said his obligation was to free the persecutor as well as the persecuted, because the persecutor is victimized by the role he's playing and by the obligation forced upon him by social strictures to act in an immoral and oppressive way. Both the persecutor and the persecuted must be freed from the bonds of that oppression, just as injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are all connected. At one point he has said, wearing a garment together. And I like that metaphor a great deal. He calls out the blaming of symptoms and outcomes when what's needed is a targeting of causes. It's a fairly simple thought, fairly simple construct that you shouldn't tackle the symptoms and you shouldn't tackle the outcomes, you should get to the root of it. But he finds it necessary to repeat that and make it clear that that is what his activism is geared toward doing, addressing the causes, not the symptoms, addressing the status quo, not the resulting outcome.
In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist. Negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation.
He puts forth a premise, a thesis, with 4 components. Collection of the facts is needed at the beginning of planning for direct action and protest, to make sure that the protest is merited, to make sure that the facts on the ground call for direct action. Do injustices exist? I think that was an easy call in Birmingham. Negotiation. This is where he first mentions very important concept in his way of thinking and acting and speaking. Negotiation. 2 sides that are opposed coming together to find that common ground. Self-purification, on the face of it, may seem a little hard to nail down, but what it means to me is to make sure that one's motives are pure and true, to make sure that we are going to engage in this direct action, in this protest, for the right reasons, without ulterior motives, and that it is in order to address injustice and replace it with justice, and to build up the brotherhood and sisterhood of man. Self-purification, we approach the protest, the direct action, with pure hearts and pure intentions. And then the direct action that results from the collection of the facts, attempts at negotiation, which of course takes 2, and self-purification. He also sets up the premise of nonviolent direct action as being hand in hand with negotiation, rather than an alternative to it. He's using rhetoric, he's using logic to make the point that there is a false dichotomy that is proposed sometimes between negotiation and direct action. Whereas to Dr. King, negotiation is a direct action, and if you are deprived of that direct action, then you have to take other direct actions, such as nonviolent protest.
You may well ask, Why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and fosters such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in a tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue.
Monologue being delivering messages at each other. Dialogue being sharing thoughts and feelings with each other. He's right in calling for dialogue. Dialogue yields results. Monologue does not. The very purpose of direct action is to enable negotiation. And when you're being deprived of the opportunity to negotiate, then protest is necessary. Constructive, non-violent tension. Tension is one of the words that he pulls out and uses as a refrain very effectively. He has opposed violent tension, but just defines a different type, constructive, non-violent tension. And if you think of tension literally, in terms of physics, pulling on, say, a rubber strap, and pulling and pulling and pulling, and ultimately it will break. And it needs to break. It needs that extreme tension in order for us to break from the past, us to break from centuries of oppressive precedent. So tense that strap, make that situation so crisis-packed that the door must open. Force the issue. If not now, then when?
My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. Lamentably, it is an historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. For years now, we have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited over 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Now, perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and your brothers and sisters at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro,
living constantly at tiptoe stance and never quite knowing what to expect. And when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair.
This section of the letter features what I call the sentence, with a capital T and a capital S. And those of you who are in my writing workshop probably know that I tend to discourage the use of run-on sentences. But if you know what you're doing, if you've learned those rules, you can give yourself license to disobey them when the purpose is served. This sentence, the sentence, begins with a prepositional phrase. But when you have seen, and then there is a list of everything that he has seen, everything that his people have been subjugated to, again and again and again. And finally, at the end of that list, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. Wait is the second time that he pulls out a specific word for additional emphasis. It was tension, and now it is wait. As he says, wait has almost always meant never. And it rings in the ears, he says, of every Negro with piercing familiarity. I'd like to remind you that the word wait is a homophone. W-A-I-T sounds exactly the same as W-E-I-G-H-T. And a case can be made that the longer one must wait, W-A-I-T, the heavier the weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, that is pressing down on you. Everything that he has chronicled in the sentence did happen over and over again to many people. It is accepted as fact, and was accepted as fact by the Southern white pastors to whom he was addressing these thoughts. There was no need to prove it because they knew. And as for that cup of endurance running over, here Dr. King, from his theological training, is making an allusion to the psalm in which a cup of goodness and love and mercy from God runneth over. This is a different kind of cup. This is the cup of endurance, and it's running over because there's no room left. It has no choice but to overflow, which is that moment of extreme tension that he called for, that will allow for a break.
One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained.
This is the heart of the letter, and a great deal is going on here. He wants to answer his critic's question. How can you break the law? Isn't it immoral to break laws? Laws, after all, were formed to enforce morality. Some do, some don't. Then, as now, some things that were illegal should probably be legal. He asks the question, the rhetorical question, in order to answer it, and he answers it perfectly. There are just and unjust laws. Just because something is a law, just because something is legal, legally sanctioned, that does not make it moral or just. He uses the example of Austro-Germany. Let's remember not only that what was done by the Third Reich was legal according to their system, but that Adolf Hitler was democratically elected. And he's explaining through all of this why he is here. Why he is here in Birmingham, why he is here in jail, and why he had really no alternative but to be here in the Birmingham jail. I like his focus on the word birthright. The human birthright, the American birthright of freedom. Traditionally, birthright is used more commonly to refer to the eldest having title to the father's land and property upon his death. The birthright of freedom means that there is not a tiered system of rights and opportunities, that all humans should have the same opportunities, the same rights, that we are all equal, that if anyone is royalty, then we are all royalty. We are all queens and, yes, kings.
I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and with deep moral concern would serve as the channel through which our just grievances could reach the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed.
In his disappointment, a lot of us find a familiar feeling. Here's where it takes me personally. My mother's father was a theologian and pastor in the Presbyterian Church based at Seabury Western Seminary. My mother herself was an adult Christian educator. Both of them believed in a gospel of love. For a lot of us raised Christian, it has become harder and harder to identify what we consider to be a gospel of love in the actions and beliefs and speeches of people who purport to represent the institution of Christianity. This isn't anything new. Arguably, it's been going on in one shape or form for about 2,000 years. There is a bumper sticker I like that says, "Christ, protect me from your followers." And it's a sad irony, because Judeo-Christianity is supposed to be about compassion and welcome. The only thing Dr. King was welcomed into in Birmingham was a jail cell. Essentially, he is branding these fellow clergy as a kind of Pharisees and saying, you're representing the power structure rather than the compassion and love that our Savior came to spread in opposition to the co-opted Jewish hierarchy, co-opted by the Romans under an occupation. Jesus was returning Judaism to its original purpose and meaning. So he claims a moral high ground here, having established why it's his to claim. And implicitly, I think he's beginning here to remind us of the nature of Jesus Christ in the world as not a conformist, but a rebel.
In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Yes, I love the church. How could I do otherwise? I am in the rather unique position of being the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ, but oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists.
I want to pause here before his conclusion to make a remark about attire. As I said, there is a metaphor in this letter about all of us wearing a shared garment. The clothing that you see is the clothing in which Dr. King was clad during the time of his imprisonment. We are accustomed to seeing him in the suit and tie in great sartorial splendor. But going to the protest, he knew he would be jailed, and so he wore jeans and a short-sleeved shirt. But the words ring out with as much authority as if he had been dressed for a public speech. He closes with these thoughts.
Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you. Not as an integrationist or civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and as a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours, for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr.
which closes the performance element of our presentation. My friend of 35 years and occasional collaborator when I get lucky, Daryl Allen Reed. Let's look at that last section of the letter. Actually, I want to start at the end. He signs off with Martin Luther King Jr. He leaves off the Reverend because he is speaking of equality, and it's well known to his audience here, the white Southern pastors, that he is speaking to them Christian to Christian. He leaves off the doctor because this is not about his graduate work or the scholarship or his relationship to academia. Keeps the junior as a nod to his beloved father. He is simply, at the end of this letter, at the end of this incredible message, Martin Luther King Jr. That's all he needs to be. I'm going to ask Daryl in a moment to reread part of this final section. But first I want to call out an amazing pivot, an amazing rhetorical pivot. If I've said anything that overstates the truth, I beg your forgiveness. In other words, if I have described a situation as being more dire than it actually is, my apologies. He can say this with confidence because he knows he has not done that. He can say this with confidence because he knows that he has described accurately and vividly the nature of the oppression under which his people have been suffering. And then the pivot into a more sincere statement. If I have said anything that understates the truth, in other words, if he has not done full justice to the injustice, I beg God to forgive me. And he ends with some poetry, because he was a great writer, and he often wrote poetic prose. Earlier, he has this wonderful line about the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. That is poetic prose, and in the form of critique. Here at the end, he's using the poetic prose to speak more positively and to speak with hope and with faith of a day when the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And as all people on earth know, when the clouds clear and the fog diminishes, then those radiant stars are able to shine. He's using nature imagery here because it's universal and because it's timeless and because we all know the beauty of the radiant stars after the clouds and the fog have passed. I did a presentation here last month that I called The Darling Buds of May, and it was about Shakespeare's love sonnets. And he used the beauty of nature to describe love. Dr. King is doing the same thing, not about romantic love, but about the love that we sometimes call charity, or we call compassion.
Agape.
Agape, exactly right. It's Greek, agape, that's right. The biggest love of all that encompasses all of the other true loves. And brotherhood and sisterhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty as the beauty of nature comes to encompass the beauty within human nature and crowd out the darkness. Would you please reread for me, for us, Daryl, the third to last paragraph?
Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers?
He's establishing a bond. He's reaching out a hand of friendship to those Southern white pastors. He's saying, please put yourself in my place, if only for a moment. Imagine what it is like for me, as a man of the cloth, to be jailed here. No mattress, no phone call, no comfortable desk, writing this to you out of the very depths of my soul. And then he concludes that section with, what else is there to do but write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers? The letter lives on. The thoughts are strange only to bigots, and the prayers continue until they are fully answered. Thank you. Happy Juneteenth. This is the 160th anniversary of the freeing of the last slaves to be freed. The year after the Emancipation Proclamation. There was no internet, there were no cell phones, there was no way to get the word out to every far corner of the South, except for Union Army soldiers to spread the word in person. That's what happened, and that's why it was the next year that finally the last slaves to be freed were given the news, and were able to become Americans. They'd always been forced here, but Americans the entire time. And now, with the rights of Americans, to the extent that Jim Crow and subsequent limitations were to place on them. 160 years ago today, in Texas, right?
Texas, 1865.
Okay. So we like to wish people a happy Juneteenth, but also a meaningful one, because holidays are generally hoped to be happy, but in the case of a holiday like this, it's a holiday that casts a shadow like we had up here. I like the fact that the bars disappeared over the course of the speech. He was writing his way to freedom for himself and his people as the charge in my flashlight faded. You know a little bit about the Texas genesis of Juneteenth, right?
By the time, the emancipation was 1864, but by the time the information reached Texas, as you pointed out before, there were no cell phones and no telegram, none of that. It took the Union soldiers actually making their way finally to Texas, and they were the last people. It was almost a year afterwards. But I will also point out that ever since 1865, Juneteenth has been celebrated in Texas by Black people. And so we're finally catching up. But that's so far away.
That's the origin of this day. Thoughts, comments, questions, remarks, anything that you want to share after hearing the performance of the letter and some of my analysis of it, both as social conscience, justice witness, and also as great literature. I'll stall for you by saying this. I like to, okay, good. I like to say that Dr. King and Anne Frank both could be known as well for the quality of their writing as for their impact on the world. Yeah. And that if Anne Frank had lived into adulthood, she very likely would have become one of the great authors of her generation. And Dr. King, though dying at 39, did become one of the great American writers through his speeches and letters. Yes, sir.
I've heard it before, but never as eloquently as you two have did it.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Really appreciate that.
Dale, do you want to talk about the difference between performing a letter like this versus a speech with which we're familiar?
Yes, I do several of King's speeches. I try not to do I Have a Dream, because it is kind of overdone and overused, and people don't always get the true meaning. When I do it, I use sections of the speech that people are not familiar with, because the natural comparison is to try and see if you sound like them, and I do not do that. I understand the greatness of the man, and I am blessed to feel like I have the vehicle by which I can understand and relate what it was that he was thinking and trying to do. It was by accident that it happened, and I'm grateful that I discovered that. But the difference is the letter is something that it hadn't been, I mean, there are snippets of it that you've heard, and that he was constantly reusing some of his themes and speeches. And so he takes snippets and do things like that. But the letter itself is so long. It was never actually done as a speech. And that compelled me also because it's so chock full of information, so chock full of emotion, that I thought it would be a good thing to actually try and do as a speech. Now, I've done it as a speech, but I worry that some of it is not accessible to most audiences. And to have one person standing there continuing to do it, no matter how deep it is, theatrically is not as conducive. And so I really welcome the fact that as we started talking, I knew that he kind of lectured on it. And I told him that this is something I've kind of been playing around with. So this is our first time really trying to mesh this. And I have since even told him I don't think that I would perform it on its own again, because he adds so much. It's so much a complete package.
Well, thank you.
Let me just say one other thing before Paul
I
gets
beg to
going.
differ, but
Before Paul gets
I
going.
think you would work just fine on your own doing the speech. By the way, this was about half of the speech.
Oh, it's not even half.
We had to tighten
About a
it
third. It's
to
about a
make
third.
it work in a 1 hour
It's
presentation.
about a third. And I'll say this, so often, I look at great people throughout history, and I think of some of those people who had friends or associates who never really gave them the credit that they would do because they knew them so well, or that they were just so accustomed to them. And I, in my life, have been blessed to be around some of the most influential and smartest and greatest people, and I give them their flowers now. I'm not gonna wait till they die and say, you should have seen this, you should have. Paul is one of those people. And I just want to commend you and thank you. Our friendship of over 35 years is part of that. And thank you. And I'm saying for any of you, there's people amongst you, you know, who are really, really good people. Just because everybody doesn't know them does not diminish their greatness. And I say, let them know.
That's it. Thank them now.
Yeah,
Thank them now.
yeah.
That's right.
And she had a question.
Was there a question here? Yes. Yeah. Did you have a question? Yes.
She says the letter that wrote in jail, that King wrote in jail, how did it get out? How did it get to people? Well,
It was smuggled in pieces, smuggled
Yeah.
in pieces
And-
through
and-
those bars.
and on papers that they hadn't given him, so they didn't know. So by the time he reassembled it, I guess he probably rewrote it.
Yeah.
But they have a copy of a visual
scraps.
copy of the scraps
Of the
that he
scraps.
actually wrote it on. But-
Grease-stained pieces of paper
Yeah.
that had been used to wrap a fish sandwich,
Right?
and torn off margins from the newspaper where there was no
No
print.
print.
That's how it.
And
That's how it reached.
it was really long. So you can imagine how much trash he must have had. It would have been trash to anybody else, but it was quite a treasure, as we all would agree.
As he said, what else was there to do? Well, he found a purpose to that time.
Somebody had a-
Another question? Yeah.
thought I saw.
I just wanted to say the way it comes together. If we look at history beyond this program, and you think, has this happened before? And you look at what happened to Jesus
Mhm.
as he was being beaten
Yes.
and ravaged for what he had to say,
Mhm.
and the reality of our lives and our religion that comes from it.
Yes.
The Old Testament figures before him, and Shaman's since.
Mm.
It's not very popular sometimes to be the rebel, to be the nonconformist, to draw outside the lines and ask people to see the bigger picture and to see the bonds that connect them rather than the fences that divide them.
Yes.
Human beings, we can look at things tribalistically. I do that as a Green Bay Packers fan so that I won't be doing it on a more significant level. But tribalism is...
Wait a minute. You didn't get booed and hissed?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Okay.
They know by now. I mean, tribalism is a part of human nature. It can be channeled, it can be funneled into things like the championship game that we're going to be watching later.
Yes.
Or it can take some very unsavory forms. Othering is probably the worst thing about human beings, up there with lack of foresight, I would say. Othering that allows people to be kidnapped en masse from Western Africa and taken across the sea, and those who live become legal property. That was legal at the time. That doesn't make it right. Othering that allows people to do that to other people based on skin color and race. Othering that allowed in Austro-Germany the Third Reich to define Jews and Roma and the disabled and queer folks as less than. Women to this day have fewer rights in many countries, and here the struggle is not complete for that matter. Native Americans who had been practicing stewardship of this land for somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 years since their ancestors came across on the Bering Strait, taking care of our continent, Turtle Island, until the so-called settlers arrived and decided these people are not fully human, and therefore carte blanche, and infected blankets are given to them, and the bison on which Plains Indians have lived for many millennia are wiped out simply to deprive the Native Americans of their source of food and garments and lodgings. Once you identify a fellow human being as the other, you can do pretty much whatever you want to them. And everything that Dr. King wrote and spoke was moving in the absolute other direction from other. Othering is for others. It was never for Dr. King. It was always about building bridges. He was not a separatist. He was an integrationist. And he looked to that day when there would be a brotherhood and a sisterhood of man, encompassing all races. It's our obligation to try to make that happen in our culture, in our society, in our country. But he gave us the game plan. Other thoughts, comments, or questions?
I appreciated the great irony of his saying that the letter would have been shorter had he written it from a comfortable desk.
Sure.
The idea that he's writing it under very difficult circumstances and it's longer is a really interesting idea, and it pertains to the whole struggle that he was in.
And the fact that he documented it that way.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yes.
And the other thing is that he wrote a wonderful piece of literature under those difficult circumstances.
That's right.
And that's what I appreciated about being here tonight was I came here wanting to hear Martin Luther King. I did hear Martin Luther King, but I also heard him through the ages. And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for that,
Yeah,
sir.
absolutely.
And we'll repeat a little of it in case people didn't hear it.
Sure.
But what did he start with? The notion that, the paradox of this letter is so long because I was so uncomfortable while writing it. That doesn't seem on the face of it to make sense. But the discomfort is part of the agony and the anguish from which he is writing and with which he is documenting the oppression of his people. The fact that I'm in a jail cell essentially requires me to write this in full and to do full justice to these injustices.
He also said that he came with the intention of wanting to hear King, but instead heard like the history or more of the panorama
King through the ages.
through the ages. Thank you.
Think about this. King talked about 340 years of oppression in that letter.
Yeah.
It's now 400. Okay. Has there been progress? Yes. Is it complete? Absolutely not. But through the ages, the message resonates. It's why there's a full house here tonight to hear the words of Dr. King as spoken by my terrific actor friend over here. And we could come back here in another 60 years. The same thing will be happening by younger people than us.
You know, I was I'll get right to you, sir. But I was recently attending a concert for Juneteenth while I was in LA, and one of the ladies who had composed a few songs for it, she said as she was talking through it
that freedom is a process, not a destination. Now, I don't know if she got it from somewhere else, but it resonated with me. And I just wanted to leave that with people.
Interesting.
Mhm.
I just wanted to comment, I think the letter, since you just used the word process, it was the process of his own evolution in terms of developing as far as he could at that time. But I think that it's not an accident that he became opposed to the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And then he tied it with the economic issue, which is probably what got him killed.
Absolutely.
The first Civil War.
Absolutely.
And that he identified, from what I understand in readings, that he identified the problems as a systemic problem.
Yes.
With our system.
That's right.
And not just an isolated event.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thank you for that, sir. And consequently had an ever-growing white following in the United States of America. Because it wasn't just race anymore. It was going to all kinds of justice, all
Because
kinds of
as
social.
you mentioned, it was the call for economic parity that I think exacerbated his demise.
Yeah. That's right, yes.
In listening to you, I heard the voice of Martin Luther King. The intonation, you are very skillful. I think.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
There can be a fine line between impersonation and inhabitants, I would say. Dr. King inhabits Daryl, or Daryl inhabits Dr. King, but it's not anything where people would laugh. You know, he's got that wonderful tremulo in his voice at times. And I'm noticing what you do with certain vowel sounds at certain times. And I'm hearing Dr. King too. Now, he forced me to listen to some, nice stuff about me, so I'm probably gonna need to do the same here. I will say first that when we first started talking about doing something for Juneteenth, I mentioned that I had done not a program as Dr. King, but a program about specifically letter from the Birmingham jail. And Daryl mentioned that he had delivered that dramatically in performance. So it seemed obvious that we, having reached it each independently,
Yes.
would need to now pool our resources. And we had a wonderful time once he came to town. He's staying at Heather's and my place for 3 or 4 nights. And we sat down. What have you done with this? What have I done with this? How can we merge them? How can we meld them into a single duo presentation that hopefully will be greater than the sum of its parts? Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, great.
The little side story about Daryl that I'll tell you, and then we'll get, there's another question, right? Okay, great. Very quickly, we met on the set of an indie film in which we were both acting 35 years ago, and we were playing in a dystopian, futuristic nightmare film, competing bounty hunters of human rebels. And my bounty hunter dies, his bounty hunter lives and wins, actually. You won. You even got the girl.
I got the girl.
Yeah, you did. Something just has caused us to stay friends throughout the interim. And a couple years ago, when we were starting to record the dialogue for my animated film, Unplugged. Okay, so it is about a young woman who is dealing with depression and post-traumatic stress following a series of sexual assaults when she was 12 by her mother's then boyfriend. And I found myself in a kind of a sticky situation because there is a flashback and there is some terrible, terrifying dialogue in the flashback between the assailant, the rapist, and our heroine when she was 12. And I thought to myself, well, the one actor I could really trust to do this with our lead, Holly, happens to be African American, and I certainly don't want the rapist in this movie to be African American, but guess what? It's animated. So our character designer created this sort of Ted Lasso-like middle-aged white guy with a mustache. And I know he can talk white. He's very good at it. He's a great actor. And so we got to, well, he's based now in LA, in Hollywood. Has worked with the likes of Rob Reiner and Woody Allen and Sean pen. And anyway, I introduced him and Holly, my young lead, and knew that they would hit it off. And we had a couple meals together, met for drinks together, because I wanted them to be as comfortable as possible. It's a hard scene to play, certainly for her, but for Daryl too, because he's the antithesis of this character, and that's why they call it acting. And so we're recording, and it's very tense, but we're doing okay. And at one point, Daryl says to me, "How was that? Was that white enough for you?" And I said, "Daryl, can you push it just a little bit wider?" And he takes it up into his nose and says, "Sure I can." And it broke the tension, you know.
It did.
Yeah. Okay, there were a question or two or comment over here.
Does anyone actually know the root of racism? The first person who ever said, "Hey, there's something wrong with it."
Wow.
Has any of that ever been tracked down?
We
She's
heard-
asking if there was
Yeah.
is there a track on the beginning of racism? Very interesting.
I have a friend who's a resident of a different retirement community who's very scientific, and
The guy we saw today.
Yeah.
With the
John.
notes and
yeah, his name is
theories.
John Edwards, but he's not that John Edwards. No, he's a better John Edwards than that. And he said that there are studies that show that it appears to be inherent. It appears to be endemic to identify those like me and those different from me, and to have a higher opinion in certain regards as those like me. I'm not saying that that's true. He had a study that backed it up. He has a study that backs up pretty much everything
yeah.
that he puts forth. If that is the case, if there is a natural inborn tendency to favor those who in one way or another are like us, then of course free will means that we can fight against such an inherent tendency. Free will means that we can go against any inherent prejudice that might exist in favor of people like us. Free will is what it is to be human. And to be fully human means, I guess, then, to contradict and work against that element of what it is to be human, if that element is inherent in humanity, if it is. And I always say it's important to be tolerant, and you need to then go beyond tolerance to welcome. Tolerance means it's all right that you're over there. You can be there. You can even maybe be a little closer to me. That's tolerance. Welcome means here we are. And then you move beyond welcome to celebration and a recognition that diversity is a gift.
Similarities.
It's a gift from the heavens and makes life worthwhile.
There's another
Yeah.
question.
Right. First, having lived in Green Bay for a long time, commend your bravery
Right? That's what I'm
in
saying.
advocating for the Packers.
That's my tribalism. There it is.
Yeah.
That's it.
But more importantly, you know, your performance is such a soul-searching, and we know we're not there, and it resonated so much with what's going on right now.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I don't mean to compare them.
No.
I mean, it's a whole different world. But man, when you see the Dodgers police say, "No, you're not coming into the stadium tonight, folks. Go away."
Yeah.
And I don't know. This is such a. You guys are so good at what you're doing, and it just brings us into the today.
Yeah.
Reality.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well,
Thank you.
You know, when Dr. King says later becomes never,
Yeah.
that reminds me of something we've been hearing in today's body politic along the lines of America first becomes America last, becomes America only. And the onlyness, I think, is what Dr. King was fighting against.
Yeah.
The loneliness and the onlyness. We need to come together.
Yes.
I forget the name of the program at Newberry, but they had something like called a Race on Race or something like that. They looked at a history of racism. and it was a really fascinating program. And as my daughter and I were driving away, I asked the question of where does racism come from, and we thought about it for a few moments, and she said it's probably the right makes the right makes the I get them turned around. Might makes right, and probably the very roots of racism is that might versus the right, and it goes way, way back then, like you were mentioning.
Right. Might makes right is from the Romans, and it is essentially in line with what would become social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, however that's defined. But Abraham Lincoln wrote, right makes might, in explaining why the Union Army would triumph. He was right.
Oh.
It was mighty right.
Mighty right. Oh, nice. I'm gonna see what you did there. There's one over here.
Yeah.
One other thing I would say, and that is that in terms of where racism comes from, be careful of hierarchy.
Yeah.
The minute that you say that one person is higher or above another, you've made the desire to be higher.
Yes.
Sometimes when the desire to be higher requires for you to invent someone who is lower.
That's a big thing for you. You talked about
Well, talk about, hierarchy and redefining birthright.
Yes.
We're all royal
Yeah.
because we're all children of God, regardless of color or anything else. And the abolitionists, importantly, were not afraid of losing privilege. And those of us like me who were born into literally every single category of privilege, as a white, straight, cisgender, Protestant, American man who ultimately became tall.
Right? Yeah.
I have to work constantly to put myself in other shoes. Fortunately, as a fiction writer and filmmaker and actor, that's my job. So empathy is required, and it needs to be encouraged as well. Everyone needs to look at each other with an agenda of empathy. It is so contrary to the way leadership in this country is going right now. And I'll just say it. The thing I hate the most about Trump, the top of that list of 863, he's a bully.
Yes.
He's a bully. Yeah.
I came tonight with a different, perspective. One of my very earliest memories is the 100th celebration of Juneteenth in Texas.
See.
As a four-year-old, 5-year-old little girl, and having my caregiver, my nanny, take me to the Juneteenth celebration, and so to remember that celebration and the joy that was a part of the freedoms.
The people who had been their so-called owners were not particularly eager to spread the news.
But also
The Union Army had to do it.
But also just the sense of celebration, celebration of freedom.
That's really stuck with you. I see it as you talk about it.
That's why we call this program a Juneteenth Jubilee. Yes, because there is that shadow, but it is a celebration. Yeah. Oh, sure. She said she was at the Centennial Juneteenth. Yeah, the
1965.
Centennial. Yeah, 65.
Yeah.
That's right. In Texas.
In Texas. Her nanny, her caregiver, took her. And so she was celebrating and still celebrating as I talking to her. Her recollection of it is very positive.
Now, Daryl is a little bit older than me, and he got to hear and see Dr. King speak when he was a little boy. Do you want to talk about that?
It was like maybe 1966 or something like that. And I remember hearing on the radio, they were having this like civil rights gathering. It wasn't a march or anything like that, but I think Harry Belafonte was there. A lot of people who were with the movement were there.
Here in Chicago, where he grew up.
Yes, I grew up here. And so it was at the old Chicago Stadium. And I remember hearing on the radio and featuring, the
the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, this must be a big, great man. He's
Have
got
all
like
those
7 names. And so I kept pestering my father. I said, I want to go. I had 4 brothers. I was the only one that he took because I was on him. I wanted to see this person. And I remember the long walk from our car to the stadium, and all the people along the way. The energy was just magnetic, and I didn't know what I was getting into. I just wanted to see this king,
Yeah.
And so I remember at least 4 times asking my dad, so Dad, when are we going to see the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? He said, he's coming. I did it about 3 or 4 times. Then finally, the 4th time I said, he said, Daryl, that's him there. He's talking. And I looked, I said, where's his crown? I expected some regalia or something. I thought I'd see this huge strapping man, but instead I saw a king, and I couldn't tell you at that time exactly what he said because I think I was there for another purpose. But I know that I got it some kind of way, and that was a great experience for me because I had almost forgotten about it until as later on as I gravitated towards this.
Yes.
It became a memory. Oh, I actually did see him. I was young, but I didn't fully grasp it. It was under a misunderstanding, but I was there. So.
Other thoughts, comments, or questions?
It's amazing to me that King started the Poor People's Campaign.
Right.
Yeah.
How strong that is.
I think that's what it was, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was.
How people have continued on giving their lives for that campaign and working together.
Yes. And thanks for mentioning that. Yeah.
One element of his remarkable legacy, the Poor People's Campaign.
Sure.
Right. Yeah.
Last thing I'd like to say is this. You said this is the first time you've done this. I hope it's not the last.
We hope not.
You two are.
Thank you. We find value in it, and it's a discovery for us, and I'm glad to see that it's being received. We do intend.
Very eloquent.
Thank you
very much, sir.
Thank you.
We appreciate everyone's presence here to honor Dr. King.
Thank you all. You guys are a great audience. Thank
Great
you.
audience.
We appreciate you guys.
Thank you.